Imagine your own life driven by a single event in which you, as a young person, were unjustly accused, tried, and convicted of a crime. And imagine that the stigma of the crime followed you throughout the rest of your life as you hunted endlessly for anonymity. Even when you became successful, even when you became famous for your literary talents, what would that do to your sense of self, your attitude, your mental health? William, Sid- William Sidney Porter, OHenry, didn't have to imagine these difficulties, he lived them. He also lived with a kaleidoscope of names. He was known as Will, Sidney with a Y, Sidney with an I, William, Sid, Henry. It was almost as though he was trying to free himself of his own identity and take on one that he created through his fiction. Even today, more than 100 years after his death, the OHenry name game continues. Google the name. On some sites, you'll find it's spelled O''Henry, O''Henry, as though he were being transported into a poet from Donegal or a Carmel and William Sidney Porter was born less than 2 weeks after the Second Battle of Bull Run and a week before the bloody Battle of Antietam. The date was September 11, 1862, in what was then the sleepy town of Greensboro in Guilford County, North Carolina. His early life was influenced primarily by his paternal grandmother, Ruth Worth Porter. She became his caregiver when his mother died in 1865. Greensboro didn't offer much in the way of education at that time. William's family was relatively well educated, but the poverty of the South in the years of Reconstruction meant that instruction was extremely difficult to come by. In later years, Will confessed that his childhood years were not very happy. He didn't get along with his older brother, Shelley, and his younger brother, David, died before Will had much to remember him by. The heroes of Will Porter and his friends were the Ku Klux Klansmen who met at the local Presbyterian high school. From there, the white-sheeted marauders went on wild rides into the countryside to burn crosses and terrify blacks. Will and his friends dressed up in sheets and paper conical hats and masks to emulate their heroes. Even more satisfying was the game of Indians. A local farmer kept turkeys which provided the boys with feathers for war bonnets and the shafts of their arrows. Ghost stories were Will's favorites for a while. Then he went on to the novels of Sir Walter Scott, William Makepeace Thackeray, Bulwer Lytton, and Willie Collins. He read Charles Dickens and wrote his own ending to The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Dickens' unfinished story. As he entered teenage, he was already writing his own stories and knew that it was the short story he wanted to be in the center of his literary efforts. He also became a reasonably talented cartoonist. OHenry later said, "I would have given my eyes for a college education." His grandmother supported his wish, but there simply wasn't enough money in the family to afford it. Will became a general handyman and clerk with an eye to learning the pharmaceutical business. That was how his father, Dr. Algernon Porter, had developed his career. By 1881, Will had become despondent. Part of the reason was his health. He was a small boy. He had a bad cough that he suspected might be tuberculosis. That was the disease that had killed his mother. And he was looking for opportunities beyond the limits of Greensboro. By this time, he was a registered pharmacist and a member of the State Pharmaceutical Association. People in town assumed he would stay in Greensboro and take over his father's store. Then, in the early months of 1882, Will's cough became so severe that his doctor, one Ferris Hall, asked him to join his family on a visit to the Rio Grande country of Texas, where the doctor's two sons were managing a ranch. Will accepted the offer, and the group caught a train at Raleigh, headed for New Orleans. Then it was west to Houston and southwest to Cotulla, where they finished their journey by buckboard. The ranch covered 250,000 acres and was later enlarged to more than 400,000 acres. Livestock included 12,000 longhorn cattle, 12,000 sheep, and herds of native Mustang horses. At the time Will arrived at the ranch, the eldest Hall son, Texas Ranger, was engaged in a running battle with rustlers. It was an exciting time for a young man from the East to be baptized in the culture of the Wild West. Will became a proficient rider and knew his job as a ranch hand. At the same time, he took to poetry, and Tennyson became his favorite. He began reading Webster's dictionary to improve his knowledge of words. And he was able to talk with visitors to the ranch, including one John Maddox, an Austin businessman. Will began writing stories about the Southwest and showed them to the wife of his boss. She was a fan of the stories of H. Rider Haggard and said Will's tales were every bit as good as any of her heroes. She encouraged him to write for magazines, but he didn't have the confidence to market his work. He continued to tear up his stories. After 2 years on the ranch, Porter lost his interest in tending sheep. His attention turned to life in the city, specifically Austin, a metropolis of 10,000 souls. An acquaintance from back in Greensboro, Joe Harrells, lived there with his 4 sons. Harrells invited Will to come and stay with them. And Austin is where Will Porter's luck turned bad, and then to terrible. His first job there was at the Morley Drug Store, where he was hired as a clerk. He felt he was doing exactly what he'd done back in Greensboro, and didn't like the thought of it. When the drugstore owner told him that part of his job was to jerk sodas, he quit in a huff. Next, he worked for John Maddox as a bookkeeper. That job lasted 2 years until an old man who lived in the hills west of Austin came into the office with a document signed by Jim Prescott, who claimed to have found the lost Bowie silver mine back in 1859. Will and one of his pals were excited by the tale and set out to search for the treasure. Jim Prescott had left directions to the mine, but 30 years had passed. Jim was long dead. There were all sorts of physical problems with the directions and map that Jim had left. Finally, time ran out, and the young prospectors had to return to the workaday world of Austin without making their fortunes. Back at work, Will met 17-year-old Ethel Estes, the daughter of Mrs. P.G. Roach. Will began courting Ethel despite the objections of her mother, who did not believe that the slender, short young man was serious enough to have her daughter's hand. There were more promising candidates to marry Ethel, but in the end, Will solved his problems by proposing an elopement. Brushing aside her objections, he whisked Ethel to the license office and then to the home of her minister. The marriage was performed that same afternoon. Will and Ethel joined and participated in musical and theater groups. Ethel encouraged Will to pursue his writing. She gave birth to a son in 1888, but the boy died hours after his birth. Then, in September 1889, daughter Margaret Worth Porter was born. 2 years passed as the Roach family eventually accepted their daughter's fate. This was probably the happiest time of Will's life. Will wrote for a number of newspapers around the country. The prose sketch was his strong suit, and newspapers welcomed his set pieces about life in the Southwest. In 1891, he again changed jobs, joining the First National Bank of Austin as a paying and receiving teller. This meant he was responsible for the cash of the bank and had to take out a $10,000 fidelity bond. He soon discovered that the bank was run in a very casual fashion. Until recently, it had been owned and operated by a single family, but had now converted to a national charter, which meant it was subject to federal examination and rules. Still, the bank officers continued to cover overdrafts without question, and if they needed a bit of cash, they wrote out a check and dropped it in the cash drawer, almost like an IOU. Sometimes they simply took the money with a note that they would repay it later. Meanwhile, marriage and illness changed Ethel, and not for the better. Will continued to see his old pals for fun and beers, but when he came home he would find Ethel up in arms. She would lay on the floor and scream at him. The marriage continued to be plagued by problems. In early 1894, Will got an opportunity to be a newspaper owner and editor. He bought a weekly and renamed it The Rolling Stone. He continued to work at the bank during the day and worked on the newspaper after hours. After only 6 months of publication, he was encouraged by the success of the Rolling Stone. He had brought it from nothing to a paid circulation of 1,500, and he imagined that number could be tripled without expanding his resources. Then his luck changed. In February 1895, Jonathan J. Gannon, a federal bank examiner, made an audit of the First National Bank of Austin. He found the bank was making loans without meetings of the directors. Then he uncovered more irregularities, including the fact that in less than a year, the overdrafts of one Frank Hamilton, the bank's vice president, had risen from $2,300 to $13,500. The bank president's overdraft had gone from $2,000 to $10,300. It was obvious that the two officers had been dipping into the till. Their overdrafts were simply withdrawals to their personal accounts. But the word on the street was that these were honorable men with good reputations in the community. The bank examiner concluded that while the overdrafts were improper, they were safe as far as the bank's security was concerned. There followed a financial inquisition to determine where the fault lay. The affairs of the bank were in such a mess that the examiners demanded that a federal case be made of the matter. When the dust had settled, the blame fell at the feet of the bank's teller, William Sidney Porter. A grand jury was convened to look into the matter further, with a focus primarily on Will. The grand jury found no evidence to indict him or anyone else and dropped the matter. But examiner Jonathan Gannon was not satisfied. He continued to press the matter, insisting that as teller, Will was responsible for everything that had happened during his time at the bank. One thing led to another, and in the end, Will was brought up on charges of embezzlement. His father-in-law helped him raise his $4,000 bail. The court allowed Will to go free until his trial date. Back in Washington, D.C., the comptroller of the currency was determined to have the small-town Southwestern Bank clean up its act, and the Austin case became a crusade. Will knew that he had been betrayed by the bank's officers and that he was going to be their sacrificial lamb. In response, he bolted. He boarded a train first to New Orleans, where he worked as a freelance journalist and became overly fond of Sazerac cocktails. He'd become a bail jumper. He informed Ethel of his decision to run away. She destroyed his letters in order to keep the feds from his trail. He began considering a residence in Honduras, which didn't have a treaty of extradition with the United States. He planned to send for Ethel and their young daughter Margaret and ride out the storm. He boarded a ship bound for Trujillo, Honduras. Then, once again, his luck, or fate, turned against him. Ethel's health failed, and in a short while her parents contacted Will to inform him that his wife was dying. When he received the news, he was determined to get back to Austin. He arrived unannounced in the Texas capital on February 5, 1897, and a week later appeared before Judge Alec Boardman in federal court. Although he was technically a fugitive, he was once again released on a new bond. For 5 months, the court did nothing. The federal prosecutor had already dropped the case once, so his take on the matter was well known. But the National Bank Examiner was eager for a trial. Will spent his time caring for Ethel. She died on Sunday, July 25, 1897. She was 29 years old. Will's trial began on February 15, 1898. All evidence presented by the prosecution was circumstantial and technical. What it boiled down to was that Will Porter was responsible for all the bank's cash. Money disappeared, and that was Will's responsibility. The details of the trial are so complex that we can't examine them here. Suffice to say that the reputable officers of the bank were willing to throw Will Porter under the bus in order to save their own hides. With very little ado, the jury found Will guilty as charged on all counts, including one count of embezzling the same money twice. He was locked up in the Travis County Jail. Friends came to call, but the trial and imprisonment went virtually unnoticed in the local press because it came at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. Will left Austin that April and became federal prisoner number 340664, and he was held in the penitentiary at Columbus, Ohio. His life in Austin was over. His wife was dead. His daughter was living with her maternal grandparents. His reputation was gone. He was 35 years old and facing a sentence of 5 years in prison. And yet, he proved to be a model prisoner. The authorities noted his experience as a pharmacist and assigned him to work in the prison pharmacy. It wasn't long before he moved on to the position of night druggist in the prison hospital, a facility that was quite modern for its time. It was outside the prison walls, surrounded by flower beds and a lawn, and shaded by trees. Will's spirits began to rise. He had filed an appeal of his sentence, and friends were working on a pardon. The prison's night physician became so confident in Will that he seldom responded to night calls, letting his pharmacist handle all but surgical needs. For all practical purposes, Will became a doctor, and yet he was still a prisoner. He wrote, "Suicides are as common as picnics here. Every few nights the doctor and I have to visit some unfortunate soul who has tried to get rid of his troubles by ending them. Meanwhile, he was soaking up the stories of his fellow prisoners and committing them to memory. By the end of his first year in prison, he had begun to write and to send his articles to newspapers and magazines. His first success was a story titled The Miracle of Lava Canyon, which was bought by McClure's magazine. At first, he used various pseudonyms in submitting his stories. Later, there were many theories about his final choice of OHenry as a literary persona. The most common theories were, first, to start a new career without the stigma of jailbird attached to his name, and second, to avoid issues with the prison authorities over his use of an underground mail system that was illegal at the time. Prisoners and staff remembered that Will wrote first drafts on small bits of paper. He often put these drafts in his desk before he left work in the morning, so the doctor he worked for could read and comment on them. He apparently wrote late at night after the night crew had finished its midnight meal. He would write with pen and ink, often for 2 hours without stopping. Then he would make his rounds of the hospital and return to his writing. 2.5 years passed. He sold several stories and received checks from publishers. He was able to send some money to his daughter Margaret, who was still living with her grandparents. After Will's conviction, they had moved to Pittsburgh. Continuing his model behavior, he was made a trustee in the prison. It was a highly sought-after position. Will was released on July 24, 1901, after serving 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days. His sentence was shortened as a result of good behavior. He went to Pittsburgh and reunited with daughter Margaret, who was now age 11, and Ethel's parents. During his time in prison, he had become cynical about society's movers and shakers. He harbored a contempt for money and power, and developed a deep compassion for the victims of society, the poor, and the downtrodden. He had gone to prison a young man of 35 years and came out 3 years later an old man with wisdom beyond his years. His soul had been hardened in the pitiless crucible of confinement. He went to prison, William Sidney Porter, and came out OHenry, writer and mysterious figure who remained so even to his closest associates. When he arrived in Pittsburgh, he moved in with Margaret and his in-laws and set up a writing space there. He'd written more than a dozen stories in prison, and they were coming out under various names: Sidney Porter, Olivier Henry, S. H. Peters, James L. Bliss, T. P. Dowd, and Howard Clark. Will had always had a thing for names. Back in Austin, he had written a letter to his friend Al Jennings and signed it William Shakespeare, Ingomar Junius Brutus Calliope, Six-Handed Euchre, Grover Cleveland, Hill City Quartet Johnson. In Pittsburgh, he was still hoping to get a newspaper job to support himself. Meanwhile, he was doing very well with magazine articles. Editors were paying him $75 for each story, and he was turning them out at a rate of more than 1 a week. But he was not happy in Pittsburgh. The underlying reason for his dislike of the city isn't clear, but as he became more successful, he realized that he could produce his writing from anywhere. He was not particularly close to his in-laws or even to his daughter. He wrote to Al Jennings, quote, I want to say that Pittsburgh is the low-downest hole on the surface of the earth. The people here are the most ignorant, ill-bred, contemptible, boorish, drunken, dirty, mean, depraved curs that I have ever imagined could exist. It's no wonder that he soon began looking for more welcoming surroundings. He wrote to the editors of Ainsley's magazine, who had accepted many of his stories for publication. He told them that he was eager to come to New York, but that he had no money for the trip. They advanced him $100. Weeks went by, but no OHenry appeared in New York. Then the editors received another message declaring that their missing writer had been visited by hardships beyond belief. Translation: saloon fever. Ainsley's advanced him another $100. This time he vowed to make good on his promise. One spring day he boarded a train for New York. There was no looking back. OHenry's most prolific writing period started upon his arrival in New York City. During this time he wrote 381 short stories. He wrote a story a week for over a year for the New York World Sunday magazine, for which he was paid $100 an issue. Among the stories to appear in the magazine were The Furnished Room, That Last Leaf, and The Gift of the Magi. His readers loved his wit, characterization, and plot twists, but the critics were not quite as impressed. Except for his time in prison, OHenry had always been a heavy drinker. When he moved to New York, that habit became even more detrimental. One of his friends estimated that he averaged 2 bottles of whiskey a day. He was up most of the night, writing or carousing, and in bed most of the day. Drink had become his nemesis and would ultimately be his undoing. He had also been a loner for most of his life. He shunned social contact, and even when he accepted invitations, he was on his guard. He was especially secretive about his time in prison. His editors often tried to make small talk by asking him about his background. His defenses went up immediately. He would stiffen and change the subject as quickly as possible. Another constant quality of his character, which was sometimes a virtue and at other times a vice, was his capacity for giving. He repeatedly asked for advances on works from his editors. They were mystified by his apparent poverty because they paid him quite generously. If they visited a restaurant with him, they soon found the answer. He would have several drinks before eating, and then something more with the meal. Then he'd often leave a tip for the waiter that matched the size of the check. On the street, he never passed a beggar without giving him a handout. In one example, a panhandler asked him for a donation. OHenry dug into his pocket, found a coin, and handed it to the man. "Here's $1," he said. "I hope it helps." They parted, and before long the man came running up holding the coin. "Mister," he said, "you gave me a $20 gold piece." OHenry simply walked on with a wave of his hand. It was as though money meant nothing to him until he ran out of it. Every editor who worked with the man had an OHenry tale to tell. He became a celebrity. Perhaps the most common speculation centered on the name, OHenry itself. Some said he began using the name as a child. Some said he would use OHenry so often as an expletive that he decided to use it as a pen name. Some claimed the name came from a romantic interlude with a woman named Lolly Cave. In any case, he came out of prison with a determination to leave his old life behind. With it went the name William Sidney Porter. Each night he walked the streets of New York's Tenderloin, an area famous for its crime and characters. He witnessed the misery of plain people and turned their lives into stories. His reaction to poverty was to give the poor a handout. A friend once asked him where he'd been the previous evening. He replied, I spent the evening alleviating the condition of a shop girl insofar as a planked steak dinner would do. The stories were endless. One night, OHenry and two friends were walking when they were approached by a young man who told them a hard luck story. One of the friends was impressed and gave the man money to tide him over. The young man disappeared quickly around the corner. OHenry's friend said, "He seemed like an honest chap." "Yes," said OHenry, "he seemed like an honest chap to me as well last night." Which is to say, there was more to his nightly forays in the streets than a search for story material. He had a real feeling for the common men and women, and particularly those who were caught in the grind of urban life. He'd change $20 into quarters and after dinner go to one of his favorite parks, handing out quarters to people he found sitting or sleeping on the benches until the $20 were gone. With time, his stories became a mixture of locations, with settings including not just New York, but Texas and Central America as well. His heroes were often outside the law, but they were always energetic men looking for a positive future. His shop girls were sometimes tear-jerking, but his vision of New York was always the great city where every emotion emerged, where anything could happen, and usually did. By 1907, OHenry's production had dropped sharply, a victim of his lifestyle of heavy eating and drinking. He published only 11 stories that year. The critics continued to belittle his work, but the reading public loved him. As a counterweight to his downward path, he began a pen-pal relationship with one Sarah Lindsay Coleman, with whom he'd had a relationship back in his youth in North Carolina. He was so pleased to have a bit of his respectable past reappear in his life that he encouraged her, sending her pictures of himself. She responded that she herself had hopes as a writer and asked him to find her a literary agent. He interrupted his own routine to find her one, and Sarah was able to sell a few of her stories. He suggested that she leave bucolic North Carolina and come to New York. He wrote, "You meet big people in every branch of art. You drink deep of the Parian spring." But Sarah Lindsay Coleman had no desire to drink from any Parian springs. She could find her muses right there in Asheville. She didn't long for any Greeks or any of OHenry's saloons either. That summer, he finally realized that he was sick with something more than a running hangover. He began writing to Sarah in a different vein. He needed the love of a good woman. He wrote, "I need a boss. I've been so no account and lazy I haven't turned out a line. I'm melancholy and dreary and lonesome." Now, this approach was more attractive to Ms. Coleman. It appealed to the mother in her. It appealed to the emotions she'd been feeling since she began corresponding with the now famous author. But she demanded that decency must be observed. She made a trip to Boston and just happened to stop in New York on her way home, as any proper lady might do. Her arrival in town gave OHenry an excuse to put aside the difficulties he was having with his editors and with the reviewers who had turned on him. He took her to dinner and lavished affection on her for the next few days. Before she left for Asheville, he proposed. But before she accepted, he needed to tell her about the mystery of his life, and he couldn't bring himself to do it face to face. When Sarah got home, she received a long letter revealing the facts of his conviction and prison term for a crime he did not commit. Sarah was entranced. She replied that she understood. He had indeed been wronged by society, and yes, she would be very happy to marry him. For his part, OHenry said he was ready to give up the bohemian life. He was ready to settle down and become a homebody. So on November 27, 1907, the two souls who had been close in youth became close once again in middle age. They were married in Miss Coleman's brother's house in Asheville, North Carolina. It seemed that everything had changed. The future looked bright. OHenry's income was rising all the time. In 1907, it was more than $10,000, a handsome amount at the time. He promised to reform, to abandon his bachelor ways, and Sarah was eager to make a home for him. After a honeymoon in Hot Springs, they returned to New York. But the new husband was hard-pressed to change his ways. He'd treated marriage to Ethel as a convenience that wouldn't interfere with his drinking and carousing with pals. As Sarah soon learned, the second marriage played out in roughly the same manner. Despite his considerable income, he was still chronically broke. Those closest to him urged him to abandon his old habits and cut down on his drinking. His doctors diagnosed his constant pain as diabetes and told him that liquor was a poison for him. That was about as effective as telling a fish to stop swimming. To get him away from city life, he and Sarah, along with daughter Margaret, moved to Good Ground, Long Island, and a house on the water. It was shady and quiet, an excellent place for a writer to get away from it all. The responsible parties around him formed an OHenry Reformation Society. The goal of the OHenry Reformation Society was to keep him on Long Island all summer and work on a novel. But he was not easily corralled. He went on escape trips to New York, where he ate and drank himself into a stupor. Sarah said, "No one could manage that man. He was a law unto himself and had a deep dislike for anything that resembled nagging or fussing." In short, he was not willing to make the reforms he had promised during the time he was courting his new wife. His writing was his life, and his life was the people he met on the streets of New York. He adapted factual situations into fiction, and he couldn't do that living in the wilds of Long Island. Even at the height of his fame, he shied away from personal publicity. The publishers of Who's Who in America asked him for a biographical sketch. He replied that there was nothing in his life worth reporting. In the end, this is all Who's Who got. Henry O., pen name of William Sidney Porter, author, born in Texas, has been cowboy, sheepherder, merchant, miner, druggist, extensive traveler. Author of Cabbages and Kings, 1905, The 4 Million, 1906, The Trimmed Lamp, 1907, The Heart of the West, 1908. Contributor to leading magazines and daily and Sunday newspapers. By the spring of 1909, OHenry was as busy as his failing health would permit. He'd been told often enough that alcohol was killing him and contributing to his diabetes, but he did not reduce his drinking. The plan for his reformation was off the track, and he was right back where he had been when the correspondence with Sarah had begun. He might have been at the top of his game if not for his lifestyle. Magazines were begging him for contributions and were willing to pay $750 for each story. He accepted all offers, but then he was unable to perform. By the summer of 1909, he had written only 4 stories, pulled out of him piece by piece by the editors of Collier's, Munsey's, and Metropolitan. He stacked up advances like cordwood, but the advances dissipated like bourbon poured from a bottle. By midsummer, he was so ill that he could not write at all. He decided to go to North Carolina for a change and a respite. When Sarah saw him, she knew he was very ill. He'd lost so much weight that his clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his gait was that of a tired old man. He went to a doctor who checked his blood pressure, hemoglobin, and heartbeat. They were all in terrible condition. Then he went into a sanitarium with a diagnosis of neurasthenia. A less polite term would have been chronic alcoholism. Moving from one health farm to another, he learned that he had cirrhosis of the heart, indurated arteries, neurasthenia, neuritis, and acute indigestion. He was medicated and made to cut out all alcohol. After a while, he felt better and returned to Sarah. They took walks in the evenings. One evening, OHenry threw his arm around her and hugged her. He said, "It's just like old times, isn't it?" In the end, it wasn't like old times at all. By the end of 1909, both his health and his advances ran out. He was deeply in debt to all his publishers. He returned to New York to work on a play, but he never wrote a line of it. He received numerous propositions to turn his stories into theatrical productions. He wrote parts of several stories that went unfinished, and spent most of his time in his old haunts around Madison Square, the bars and saloons and restaurants where the girls lined up to fleece tourists. He was sick almost every day. On the evening of June 3, 1910, OHenry was trying to work in his rooms. He'd been suffering for several days with bladder problems. His kidneys had finally given up. He called for help, and one Charles Hancock came to his aid. He and the doctor took a taxi to Polyclinic Hospital, where he got a room. An emergency operation on his bladder received the pressure, but the doctor told him he was suffering from advanced liver cirrhosis, kidney failure, diabetes, and the most dilated heart the doctor had ever seen. When Sarah got the news in North Carolina, she boarded a train for New York. But there was nothing to be done for his condition. His heart had been strained too much. It was apparent OHenry was slipping away, and he knew it. He died shortly after 7 a.m. on June 5, 1910, 3 months before his 48th birthday. For the man who had shunned publicity for his entire life, his funeral became quite an event. His pallbearers were all notable figures in the world of literature and journalism. When the pallbearers assembled outside the Church of the Transfiguration in New York, they met a large wedding party that was also headed inside. It turned out that the wedding was scheduled for the same time as OHenry's funeral. The wedding party stood around the outside of the church while OHenry was memorialized. Then the pallbearers brought the coffin outside, and the wedding attendees streamed in. Imagine what the great short story writer could have done with that scene. OHenry was buried in Riverside Cemetery in Asheville, North Carolina. His daughter Margaret had a short writing career after that. She married cartoonist Oscar Cesar in 1916 and was divorced 4 years later. She died in 1927 and was buried next to her father. For all his faults, OHenry left a lasting mark on the American literary scene. He was an absolute favorite of magazine readers and editors, having produced hundreds of short stories, a few novels, theatrical works, and essays. His stories have no great interest as literature, but they document some of the important changes that were taking place in American writing in general, and in America's opinion of itself in the first years of the 20th century. He was a master of surprising endings, and he usually designed story plots dramatically and made some unexpected changes at the end, which was beyond his readers' expectations. His legacy continues in the OHenry Award, one of the most prestigious short story prizes in America. The OHenry Award is an annual American award given to short stories of exceptional merit. A second awards program, the Penn OHenry Prize Stories, is an annual collection of the year's 20 best stories published in U.S. magazines. The award was first presented in 1919 and funded by the Society of Arts and Sciences. Today, the guest editor chooses 20 short stories, each an OHenry Prize story. For an extensive compilation of OHenry's short stories, pick up a copy of OHenry 101 Stories, published by the Library of America. It's available at your local library. O. Henry, a man of mystery.